This is a recording to replace the week 1 lecture for word and image, which unfortunately, using the automatic lecture recording system, didn't record audio. So I apologise for that. I've reported the fault to the service desk, but as yet I don't have a definitive response. So if I don't have a response by week 2 lecture, I'm going to actually record the lecture as I speak on my own laptop, and I'll upload that to YouTube. This replacement lecture I'll record probably in about 3 slots so that I can get it done today, and I'll upload those to YouTube and let everyone know in an announcement what the YouTube address is, but also I'll embed the YouTube videos on a page in the Canvas site so that you'll be able to watch it from there. So I do apologise, and I'm trying to resolve the problem. Word and image is basically broken into 4 segments, and one of those segments looks at ekphrastic artwork. And ekphrastic poetry is poetry that responds to visual art, but this first example is an example of where the response is the other way around. So William Carlos Williams wrote this poem, The Great Figure, when he observed a fire engine driving along a rainy street. This was in the first quarter of the 20th century, and Charles Hellmuth did a painting in response to William Carlos Williams' figure. So there is this strong relationship between the written word in poetic forms, in fiction forms, in non-fiction forms, and visual imagery, and that's something we're going to be exploring in this unit. But also, another thing we're going to be exploring in the unit is the extent to which we can become aware of how writing is itself material. So here we have an example on the left, this example here, from Lewis Carroll, where he's written in the shape of the mouse's tail, and he's writing about a mouse. So he's actually using this materiality of words and the materiality of paper to make a different layer of meaning in what he's writing in words. And then on the right at the top, we have a poem by Langston Hughes, which I've included because it's the more traditional way of thinking about imagery and the visual in poetry, where the visual is brought into this poem through this very rich description, like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore, stink like rotten meat. So this way of making meaning through visual imagery in words is something we're more familiar with. And another thing that we'll be looking at this semester is graphic forms of fiction and non-fiction. This is an example from Marianne Satrapi's work Persepolis, which is an autobiographical account of her growing up in Iran, which was also adapted into a movie. So all of this is focusing on this idea of writing and it having materiality. And Mike Sharples, in his book How We Write, Writing as Creative Design, says that the language, visual appearance and physical form of a text together constitute the writer's communication with the reader. They embody or encode assumptions about the nature of that communication. So, for example, if we look at the traditional 2-page spread, the assumptions there are that everyone wants to read in a linear fashion and they want, complete sentences. If we look at the example of the artist's book on the left, the assumption about communication there is that communication is a really complex process, and that meaning can be made through complex combinations, image, line, and white space on a page. So I'm actually going to open up this poem. This is a poem by Frank O'Hara, and it was written in response to this painting by Mike Goldberg, or actually the process of making this painting, as will become obvious as we read a bit of this poem. I am not a painter, I am a poet. Why? I think I would rather be a painter, but I am not. Well, for instance, Mike Goldberg is starting a painting. I drop in, sit down and have a drink, he says. I drink, we drink. I look up. You have sardines in it. Yes, it needed something there. Oh, I go. And the days go by and I drop in again. The painting is going on and I go and the days go by. I drop in. The painting is finished. Where's sardines? All that's left is just letters. It was too much, Mike says. But me? One day I am thinking of a colour, orange. I write a line about orange. Pretty soon it is a whole page of words, not lines. Then another page. There should be so much more, not of orange, of words, of how terrible orange is, and life. Days go by. It is even in prose. I am a real poet. My poem is finished, and I haven't mentioned orange yet. It's 12 poems. I call it Oranges. And one day in a gallery I see Mike's painting called Sardines. So O'Hara's saying he's written 12 poems about oranges and hasn't mentioned the word oranges. And Mike Goldberg's poem, you can see the traces through here of the words sardines, but he's done a painting called Sardines, where sardines, the word, is not obvious. So in a way, O'Hara is pointing up this very interesting and complex and dynamic relationship between words and visual art, that they are actually very similar, and the work of the poet is very similar in many ways to the work of the visual artist. Also in here we have a link to show you those 12 poems that O'Hara references. So here they are, Oranges, 12 pastorals. And you can see that, as he says in the poem, he's written them in prose. And that's certainly something we're going to talk about in the semester. We're going to talk about prose versus poetry in lines, because this notion of materiality also involves the materiality of where we place words on a page and where we leave white space and how that functions. And of course, one of the differences between prose poetry and poetry in lines is the relationship between the words and the white space. So I'm just going to leave that first segment of the lecture here, and I'll upload that first and do a test and just make sure it's working for you, and then I'll come back after my next meeting and record the rest. There'll be about another 30 minutes.